Thank you, Peter, for joining us. We are going to move briskly because we have a very fecund mind and we have a lot of ground to cover. So let me put it to you directly. You've roused great controversy with your claim that the rate of innovation is slowing down. How do you substantiate that? Is this an assertion or is this an assessment? Is it based on data or is it based on impressions?
Well, it's extremely hard to measure how much technological progress we have as a society, and there's so many different things that go under the rubric of technology, science and technology. My claim is that over the last 40 years, since the 1970s, we've continued to have very fast progress in the world of bits, computers, internet, mobile internet, that whole ensemble of things. We've had much less progress, I think, in just about everything else. And so a lot of things that people would have called technology in the 50s and 60s, supersonic aviation, space travel, underwater cities, desalination plants to turn deserts into farmland or forests, the green revolution, agriculture, medicine, biotech, where there's been some but not as much progress. A lot of these things are no longer even considered technology today. And so I think we've had this narrow cone of progress. And it is, I think, reflected in a general sense of stagnation in our society, where median wages have not gone up that much in the last 40 years. And so even though, and I think the people in the tech industry, in the science and tech industry, are always super bullish. They're always pumping their companies, their inventions, their research. The venture capitalists are very guilty of this. And so you have to always, I think, discount a little bit of that skew.
In your book, 0 to 1, and in your investing life, you're very disdainful of incremental progress. You urge that people should seek big changes. Let me push back on you on that. I mean, in the area of transportation, for example, if you look out the window a road, you see technologies that are conceptually identical to those that you would have seen 100 years ago. The train, the plane, the truck, the motor car, all there. They're the same, except when you look at the costs, the cost of moving goods has dropped by over 90% in the past 100 years. The safety with which we move people the chances of being killed in a car accident are 1/17 of what they were in the 1920s. And humble technologies like the container box may have contributed more to globalization than all of the amazing things you do in Silicon Valley. Karl Marx said that at a certain point, changes in quantity become changes in quality. Can you explain to us why you think those things are less important than the kinds of visionary things you talked about a minute ago?
Well, they are. There's certainly there are many of these that have had a cumulative effect of being incredibly valuable. My approach is in many ways a how-to advice book for people who are going to start companies, who are going to found companies. And I think that if you want to start a successful company, you want to do something where you have a monopoly, where you're doing something nobody else in the world is doing it, and where there's a significant difference between what you're doing and what everybody else is doing. And I think software has been characterized by these fairly large breakthroughs, which is why people in software have made so much money. It's not because it's more valuable. It's because the microeconomics of software are very monopoly prone and very lucrative. And I think the very disturbing history of innovation is that most of the inventors and scientists and technologists never made any money. The Wright brothers didn't make money. Tesla made no money in the 19th century. You know, even if we go back to the steam engine and the first industrial revolution, which represented tremendous progress. It was 5 to 10% efficiency gains every year over the course of 7 decades, from 1780 to 1850. Even in 1850, most of the wealth in Britain was still held by the landed aristocracy. The people who started textile factories, it was all competed away. And so I think if you want to start a very successful business that makes a big difference, that's the sort of thing to do. Disk drive manufacturing in the 1980s, you could come up with a new disk drive that was better than anybody else's, but then it would in turn be superseded 1.5 or 2 years later. And so over the course of a decade, disk drives became dramatically better. Everybody who started a disk drive company or invested in them lost all their money. And so there are these two very different kinds of narratives at work.
So that a wise financial head once said to me, there's all the difference in the world between a great investment and a great company. So when you talk about these concerns of yours, you're talking about them from the point of view of the investor in these technologies, not from the point of view of the business or the consumer.
Well, I think it's all of the above. Certainly, I think if we build more breakthrough technology companies, I think that will also be valuable to society. That's one modality of how things progress. You could make a lot of progress through incremental innovation. I would argue that most of that happened in the 19th and first half of the 20th century, and it's been slower in the last 40 years, even in many of these incremental areas.
When you talk about this slowdown, what you're really lamenting is the fading of what might be called big engineering schemes, superhighways. You talk in your book about this project that somebody developed to turn San Francisco Bay into a freshwater lake. I was really startled that that was your point of view, because what drove the heyday of big engineering was the heyday of state power. And whether it was the New Deal in the United States or the Soviet Union or Mussolini's Italy, it was the application of state power on a massive scale that made these things possible. And what brought an end to the era of big engineering is a set of ideas that I would have thought you would have endorsed. It was Jane Jacobs overcoming Robert Moses and saying, your big engineering project only exists because you've overridden property rights and because you haven't done your cost accounting properly. And if you actually had to pay every urban resident whose house you've just demolished in the name of urban renewal, if you had to pay all the farmers and all the fishermen whose livelihoods are taken away by turning San Francisco Bay into a freshwater lake, you would see it made no sense. This whole project never made any sense except from the point of view of a central governing state entity.
Well, I'm somewhat partial to Robert Moses, and I certainly think that ever since Jane Jacobs won that battle in the 60s, nothing new has been built in New York City. So there's sort of a tricky trade-off there. I would say we can distinguish three different modes of innovation. So there's incremental progress where you keep iterating. I think we do that pretty well, although I say we've done less of that the last 40 years. There are breakthrough point technologies, which we still do occasionally and are very valuable. And then there are things where you involve, which require complex coordination of getting a lot of different pieces to work together in just the right way. And that is a form of progress we used to do that we don't do anymore. Part of it, you're right, was government, so certainly like things like the Manhattan Project or the Apollo space program. But I think there was also a lot of it that had more of a private sector feel. Sort of the late, the 19th century America, early 20th century America was dominated by these sort of engineer, schemer type people. These people who had some complex plan to build a transcontinental railroad or a canal through Panama or all sorts of things like this. The Ford Motor Company was, again, sort of a vertically integrated, complex monopoly. There are interesting companies like that that are being done, but they're notable for their rarity. So if you ask, what did Tesla do that is new, the electric car company, or it was not that they invented any single new thing. It was that they combined a whole bunch of different things together in just the right way to create a dramatically better car. I think this was also a big part of what Steve Jobs did successfully when he repositioned Apple from a home computer to a consumer electronics company. The original iPhone, iPod, these were not, there was no single massive breakthrough. It was not really an incremental improvement. It was certainly not an incremental improvement. It was not a point breakthrough, but it was a complex coordination. And so I think it's a modality of progress that is very underexplored. Now, I'm politically more libertarian, and so I am skeptical of government being able to do these things, but not in an absolute sense. I think our government was able to do them in the 30s and 40s and 50s in a way that it no longer is able to do today. And this is, I think, a very important policy question we should think about really hard. Today, a letter from Einstein to the White House would get lost in the mailroom. And there is a sense we could not do Apollo. And whatever you think of the Affordable Care Act, I will maintain that an internet website is a demonstrably inferior and simpler and easier technology than building a rocket to send someone to the moon. And so there has been this very strange decline that we need to think about really hard.
Unlike many in Silicon Valley, you are acutely conscious that the pattern of growth in the recent American economy has left many Americans behind. There was a survey released just this morning by a very solid polling agency that reported that 45% of Americans say that their personal finances have not recovered to where they were before the financial crisis. This is something that preoccupies you. Can you suggest, and maybe I'm putting you too much on the spot, one policy change that might make a difference for the 70, 80, 90% of Americans who are not experiencing the benefits of economic growth?
Well, this is a very, you know, there's sort of, I think there's sort of three separate debates in this inequality debate. One is it happening and is it increasing? And I think the answer to that is broadly yes. Then there's a second question, which is why is this happening? Which is a very different question, much harder to question. I think almost all questions that start with the word why are very hard to answer. But I think the answer to that is it's probably very overdetermined, and there's sort of a number of different factors that are leading to it, and they need to be sorted through, you know, very, very carefully. And then I think there's a question, what do you do about it? If I had to answer the why question, I think we tend to put too much of the blame on technology that displaces workers and not enough on the challenges from globalization. So I think the competition from people in China and India has been a much greater source of pressure on the middle class than the replacement by computers. And the simple reason for this is that people Chinese and Indians are much more like Americans than computers. They are natural substitutes, whereas computers are fundamentally complementary and not really substitutes. So I think I think we tend to scapegoat technology and downplay some of the challenges with globalization. I'm not against globalization. I'm in favor of it, but I think that's where a lot of the challenges come from. In terms of what to do about it from a policy perspective, I think that's quite challenging. But
I'm not asking you to solve the whole problem. Just suggest one thing.
Well, again, I would say I would say the thing that people experience is the stagnation of not getting ahead. And in places like New York or Silicon Valley, one of the main manifestations of this is the incredibly high cost of housing. So if we could turn affordable housing back into something that was a real thing, rather than just this weird racket that people use to get zoning permits. If you turned affordable housing back into a good thing, that would be very good. So I think it's an interesting question. Why did housing shift from something that was seen as a consumption good, and therefore the cheaper it was, the better, using your earlier point, to something that's seen as an investment, where we're happy if housing prices go up, and we're disturbed if they go down. And I think we should shift our perspective on housing, see it as a consumption good, see it as something you want to produce much more cheaply. I'd be much less restrictive on zoning laws. All these things I would rethink.
Well, one thing for which you are, one issue in which you are now joining the fray in a very intense way is your negative feelings about higher education, and you are the holder of a distinguished university degree and legal degree. But I want to get to the bottom to make sure I understand the nature of your critique. Is your complaint that students are studying the wrong things, or is your complaint that they are getting too little value for money? And if the former, because you also are skeptical of the value of humanities degrees, is there a risk here that we're being blinded by paying too much attention to elites? I just looked it up. There are 1.7 million bachelor's degrees, or four-year degrees, conferred in a typical year. And the vast majority of them, of course, are not in the liberal arts. The vast majority of them are at non-selective schools. Single biggest area of degree is a field of business. 365,000 of the 1.7 million are in business or commerce.
Yes. So my focus is mainly on the elite universities, because I think that's what sets the tone and the template for so much that happens in our society. And I think there is this problem where people are incredibly tracked into these places, and then our talented people all go to the same short list of schools and then end up in the same short list of careers. And there's sort of an autobiographical part to this, where I was hyper-tracked. My 8th grade yearbook, one of my friends wrote in, "I know you're going to make it into Stanford in 4 years." I got into Stanford 4 years later. I got into Stanford Law School. I ended up at a big law firm in New York. From the outside, it was a place where everyone wanted to get in. On the inside, it was a place where everyone wanted to get out. After I left after 7 months and 3 days, one of the people down the hall from me said, I didn't know it was possible to escape from Alcatraz. And the reality was all you had to do was go out the front door and not come back. People could not bring themselves to do that because their identities were so wrapped up in these competitions they had won. And I think what's happened with a lot of higher education is that it's not about learning, it's about a tournament. And so if you were running one of these top universities, if you wanted to get fired the next day and you want to get sort of a mob of students, alumni, and faculty to run after you with pitchforks, the one thing you should propose is to double the enrollment. And why shouldn't Harvard double or triple its enrollment? We had 200 million people in the US in 1970. You now have 7 billion people in the world. And they're not doubling the enrollment because their model is not to educate people. It is to be a Studio 54 where you have a large velvet rope with a preferably really, really long line of people and a tiny number of people who get in, where it's a zero-sum tournament driven around exclusion. And I don't think that's the right way for us to think about our future. It should not be that you go to Yale or you go to jail. We have to create more alternatives for our society.
We only have a minute and a half, but I don't want to let you go back past that so quickly. For many Americans, it remains true that a university degree is the pathway to the middle class. We're not talking about the super elite. We're talking about the people, the broad middle who have not done so well. One thing that they can do that makes a difference, now maybe it won't be true if 100% of Americans do it, but so long as 35% of Americans do it, completing that 4-year degree for the 1.7 million people who do it a year, that makes a huge difference. Are you really telling them don't? Are you telling them don't study English?
Well, I don't want to talk to those.
You're telling them don't borrow.
Well, I don't want to talk about those people because if they fall through the cracks, they're really in trouble. That's why I'm focused on students at elite colleges, because it's much less risky for them to try some other things. I do think we have very tricky questions. Why is it that there is no safety net? Why is it that you have to get these degrees to get ahead? And I think you have all these questions about. I do think you have all these very tricky questions about how much of it is causal versus correlated. So, does the degree, is that what gives you the advantage, or is it the signaling or the selection? And so, if you're able to get into a 4-year college, if you're able to complete it, that selects for somewhat more talented people, and it signals to people that you're disciplined enough to sort of plow through this. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've learned something. And so I do think the amount that's being spent on it is very disproportionate. And there are many cases where things go wrong. About 40% of the people who start 4-year colleges don't finish them. They still end up with lots of student debt. And if you start a 4-year college and don't finish it, you're probably worse off than if you didn't even start because of the enormous student debt problem. It's very different from, when I talk to people who are sort of in their 50s and 60s about it, they always think I'm really crazy because they went to college at a time when it gave you a tremendous advantage, you didn't leave with a lot of debt. I think when you talk to people in their 20s, they still feel like they have to go to college. They can't imagine doing anything else. There's this failure of the imagination. But there are some really serious downsides with the debt you start with. And it's not a good place to start life with $100,000, start your career with $100,000 in debt. The bankruptcy laws in this country were rewritten in 2005. You cannot get out of college debt, even if you go personally bankrupt. It attaches to you for the rest of your life, and you will just, garnish your Social Security checks to pay it off in your 60s and 70s.
We are in debt to the clock. We are over time. Peter Thiel, thank you. Thank you all for your attention.